My wife was standing at the ranch gate, calm and patient. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't threatening anyone. She was simply protecting our land. The access road had been blocked for years, legally, clearly marked. Then an HOA woman showed up. She said my wife was violating community rules by stopping her from driving through our ranch. People tried to explain it wasn't HOA property. She didn't care. She said HOA authority came before private land, before safety, before common sense. Neighbors started watching. Phones came out. She demanded the cops be called. What she didn't know was this: the woman she was threatening at the gate was my wife, and she is the police chief. Before I tell you what happened next, tell me where you're watching from, and please hit subscribe for more stories where the good guys always win. My wife was standing at the ranch gate, calm and patient, with the late afternoon sun stretching long shadows across the gravel road. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't threatening anyone. She wasn't blocking the road with her body or making a scene. She was simply standing where the gate had always been, one hand resting on the cool metal bar, the other holding a folded folder of documents she had brought out of habit rather than necessity. The ranch was quiet in the way only open land can be, with the wind moving slowly through the grass and the distant sound of cattle lowing near the tree line. Nothing about the moment felt like trouble was coming. The access road had been closed for years, long before the new HOA development crept up toward our fence line. The closure was legal, surveyed, filed with the county, and approved after a series of safety incidents involving livestock and speeding vehicles. Reflective signs were posted. The gate was locked during certain hours and open during others, exactly as outlined in the agreement. It was not ambiguous. It was not temporary. It was not negotiable. Anyone who bothered to look at the records would know that. Anyone who bothered to listen would understand it. Then the HOA woman arrived. She pulled up fast in a spotless SUV, tires crunching aggressively on the gravel as if the road itself had offended her. She stepped out with sharp movements, phone already in her hand, sunglasses perched on her head like armor. Before my wife could say a word, the woman announced that the gate needed to be opened immediately. Her tone was clipped and practiced, the kind used by people who were accustomed to being obeyed without question. She said my wife was violating community rules. She said residents had complained. She said she had authority. My wife listened. She always listens first. When the woman finally paused, my wife explained calmly that the road was private property and permanently closed. She pointed to the posted signage. She offered to show the county paperwork. She even suggested an alternate route that added only a few minutes to the drive. The explanation was clear, polite, and complete. It should have ended there. It didn't. The HOA woman shook her head and laughed, a short, dismissive sound that carried across the open space. She said HOA rules were more important than personal opinions. She said inconvenience to residents was unacceptable. She said the gate would be opened one way or another. When my wife repeated that it was not HOA land and never had been, the woman stepped closer, invading her space, jabbing a finger toward the lock as if that alone could undo years of law and paperwork. Neighbors began to gather at the edges of the road. Some stood on porches. Others leaned against vehicles that had stopped to see what the commotion was about. A few people tried to explain the situation, mentioning surveys, fences, and past meetings. One older man reminded her that the ranch had been there long before the HOA. She waved them all off. She said feelings didn't matter. She said rules were rules, and she was there to enforce them. Phones came out. You could feel the shift then, that subtle change in the air when people sense something is about to go wrong. The wind picked up, rattling the gate lightly. My wife remained exactly where she was. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't step back. She didn't argue. She simply repeated, one last time, that the gate would not be open and that the woman was trespassing. That was when the HOA woman announced she was calling the cops. She said it loudly, turning slightly so everyone could hear, as if the words themselves carried power. She told the dispatcher that an uncooperative ranch worker was blocking community access and refusing lawful orders. She exaggerated. She embellished. She pointed dramatically while speaking, making sure the camera lenses around her captured the moment. She ended the call with a satisfied look as if she had already won. My wife said nothing. She didn't correct her. She didn't interrupt. She didn't reveal anything. She simply stepped back from the gate, folded her arms, and waited. To the OA woman, that silence looked like surrender. To the neighbors who knew her, it looked like restraint. Minutes passed slowly. The sun dipped lower. Dust hung in the air from passing cars forced to turn around. The HOA woman continued to complain to anyone who would listen, narrating her version of events for every phone pointed in her direction. She talked about power. She talked about consequences. She talked about how people like my wife needed to learn their place. Then the patrol vehicles appeared at the far end of the road. Lights flashing, gravel spraying lightly as they slowed. The sound cut through the chatter instantly. The old woman straightened, smoothing her jacket and adjusting her hair, preparing for her victory speech. The officers stepped out, scanning the scene, taking in the gate, the signs, the crowd, and finally my wife. The HOA woman rushed toward them, talking fast, pointing back at the gate, demanding action. She said she wanted arrests. She said she felt threatened. She said this kind of defiance couldn't be tolerated. One officer raised a hand gently, asking everyone to slow down. That was when one of them looked at my wife more closely. There was a pause, a flicker of recognition, a subtle change in posture. Before anyone else could say a word, my wife reached into her pocket and removed her badge, holding it at her side, not raised, not flashed, just visible enough to be unmistakable. The effect was immediate and absolute. The officers stood straighter. Radios went quiet. The crowd fell silent. Even the wind seemed to stop. The HOA woman followed their gaze. She stared at the badge, then at my wife's face, and then back at the badge again, as if her eyes were refusing to accept what they were seeing. Her mouth opened slightly, words forming and disappearing before they could come out. The confidence drained from her posture in real time. What she didn't know, what she never bothered to ask, was that the woman she had been threatening at the gate was not a ranch worker, not a neighbor she could intimidate, not someone who needed to be taught a lesson. She was my wife, and she is the police chief. The ranch had never been a mystery to anyone who truly lived in the area. Long before the HOA signs went up, before the sidewalks were poured and the identical mailboxes were installed in perfect rows, the land had been open, working ground. It was measured in acres, not lots, and its boundaries were defined by fences, survey markers, and decades of recorded deeds, rather than by decorative stone monuments and laminated rulebooks. My wife and I had bought the ranch because of that openness, because of the quiet, and because it was a place where responsibility mattered more than convenience. The access road that caused all the trouble was never meant to be a shortcut. Years ago, before the housing development expanded, it had been a simple service road used for ranch equipment, feed trucks, and emergency access during wildfire season. Over time, as more houses appeared and traffic increased, problems followed. Cars sped through without regard for livestock. Gates were left open. One evening, a calf was struck and killed because a driver was in a hurry and assumed the road was public. Another time, children from the nearby neighborhood wandered onto the property, unaware of the dangers posed by equipment and animals. Those incidents weren't hypothetical risks. They were real, documented, and serious. That was why the county became involved. Meetings were held, surveys were ordered, maps were reviewed down to the inch. Lawyers for both sides sat across long tables and discussed easements, liability, and safety concerns. In the end, the decision was clear. The road was private property. Any previous informal use did not grant permanent access. The gate would be installed. Signage would be posted. Emergency services would retain controlled access through a locked system, coordinated directly with the ranch. Everything was written down, stamped, filed, and archived. It was boring, methodical, and legally airtight. My wife knew every detail of that process because she insisted on it. She believed that clarity prevented conflict, and documentation protected everyone involved. She kept copies of the agreements not because she expected trouble, but because experience had taught her that trouble often came from people who refused to read what was right in front of them. The folder she carried to the gate that day wasn't a prop, it was habit. The HOA, on the other hand, operated very differently. Their rules were thick, glossy, and aggressively confident. They governed lawn height, paint colors, mailbox placement, holiday decorations, and parking arrangements. For residents inside the development, those rules were accepted as part of the trade-off for uniformity and shared amenities. But over time, the HOA leadership began to blur the lines between authority and assumption. They grew used to issuing notices and having them obeyed without resistance. They confused compliance with legitimacy. The ranch did not fit into their framework. It couldn't be fined into submission or shamed into agreement. It existed outside their jurisdiction, both geographically and legally. That reality frustrated certain HOA members, especially those who valued convenience above all else. To them, the closed gate wasn't a safety measure or a property boundary. It was an obstacle, and obstacles, in their minds, were meant to be removed. My wife had dealt with that mindset many times before in her career. People often believed that repetition could replace legality, that confidence could substitute for authority. She recognized the pattern immediately in the way the HOA woman spoke. The language was familiar: rules, violations, complaints, consequences. What was missing were words like survey, deed, county, and law. That omission wasn't accidental. It was convenient. Standing at the gate, my wife understood something important. This wasn't really about the road. It was about control. The HOA woman wasn't there to resolve a misunderstanding. She was there to assert dominance, to prove that her role carried weight beyond the boundaries of her development. Admitting she had no authority would mean admitting limits, and limits were unacceptable to someone who had grown accustomed to power without challenge. That was why explanations failed. Every time someone tried to calmly outline the legal reality, it threatened the narrative she had built for herself. Accepting facts would mean backing down in front of an audience, and pride rarely allows that. Instead, she doubled down, clinging harder to her rulebook as if it were a universal law rather than a private agreement among homeowners. The neighbors who watched understood this on some level, even if they couldn't articulate it. They had seen similar confrontations play out over smaller issues: parking disputes, fence lines, noise complaints. This one just happened to involve more land, more authority, and higher stakes. That was why phones came out so quickly. People sensed that this wasn't a simple disagreement. It was a collision between entitlement and reality. My wife remained calm throughout because she trusted the process. She trusted the documentation. She trusted the law. Most of all, she trusted herself. She didn't need to prove anything to the HOA woman in that moment. The truth didn't require theatrics. It simply waited. The irony was that if the HOA woman had listened, really listened, the situation could have ended peacefully in minutes. She could have walked away with dignity intact and perhaps even learned something about the limits of her role. Instead, she chose escalation. She chose to treat private land like a personal inconvenience and legal boundaries like optional guidelines. That choice would define everything that followed, because rules do matter, real rules, the kind written into law, enforced by evidence, and grounded in responsibility rather than ego. And standing at that gate, with the ranch behind her and the crowd watching, my wife represented those rules in their truest form, not as a threat, not as a performance, but as a quiet certainty. The HOA woman didn't understand that yet. The moment the HOA woman finished her call with the dispatcher, something in her demeanor shifted. It was subtle at first, a straightening of her shoulders and a tightening of her jaw, but it carried the unmistakable confidence of someone who believed authority was already on its way to back her up. She paced near the gate, heels crunching against the gravel with sharp, impatient steps, occasionally glancing down the road as if expecting the patrol cars to materialize on command. Each glance that came up empty only made her louder. She began narrating the situation to no one in particular, her voice pitched high enough to ensure that every neighbor within earshot could hear her version of events. She described herself as a representative of order. She described my wife as uncooperative, defiant, and obstructive. She used words like non-compliance and violation, carefully chosen to sound official while remaining vague enough to avoid scrutiny. The more she spoke, the more she seemed to convince herself that repetition alone could turn fiction into fact. My wife stood a few feet away, unmoving, her expression neutral. She had shifted her weight slightly, resting one boot against the fence post, hands relaxed at her sides. To an untrained eye, she might have looked disengaged, even bored. In reality, she was observing everything. She watched how the HOA woman interacted with the crowd, how she reacted when someone disagreed, how quickly frustration tipped into aggression. Years in law enforcement had taught her that escalation rarely happened all at once. It came in layers, each one thinner than the last. A neighbor finally stepped forward, a woman who had lived near the ranch for over a decade and had attended more county meetings than most people cared to remember. She spoke carefully, choosing her words with the precision of someone who knew how easily situations like this could turn hostile. She explained again that the road closure was legal, that she had personally seen the paperwork, that this argument had already been settled years ago. For a brief moment it looked as though the HOA woman might actually listen, then she scoffed. She accused the neighbor of spreading misinformation. She said people were tired of being inconvenienced by outdated agreements. She implied that the ranch owners were selfish for prioritizing livestock and safety over the comfort of commuters. Her voice grew sharper with each sentence, edges cutting through the calm afternoon air. When another neighbor pointed out the clearly visible boundary markers, she dismissed them as irrelevant technicalities. The crowd grew thicker as more residents arrived, drawn by the raised voices and the promise of drama. Some stood quietly, arms crossed, watching with unease. Others whispered among themselves, already speculating about how the situation would end. Several phones were held aloft now, recording continuously. The HOA woman noticed and leaned into it, angling her body toward the cameras, projecting certainty and outrage in equal measure. At one point, she stepped directly in front of the gate and placed her hand on the lock. That was when I wife finally spoke again. Her voice was calm, measured, and firm, cutting through the noise without rising above it. She told the woman to remove her hand from the gate and to step back onto the public road. She stated clearly that the woman was trespassing and that any further interference with the property could result in legal consequences. There was no anger in her tone, no threat. It was simply a statement of fact. The HOA woman spun around, eyes flashing. She accused my wife of intimidation. She accused her of abusing power she didn't have. She laughed loudly and said she couldn't wait for the police to arrive and sort this whole thing out. She gestured broadly to the crowd as if inviting them to witness justice being served. The irony of her words went completely unnoticed by her. Minutes dragged on. The sun climbed higher, heat shimmering faintly off the road. The HOA woman continued to pace, alternating between phone calls, complaints to the crowd, and pointed stares at my wife. Each time someone suggested she leave and resolve the matter through proper channels, she brushed them off. Backing down was no longer an option in her mind. Too many people were watching, too many cameras were rolling. My wife, meanwhile, noticed the small things. The way the HOA woman's hand shook slightly when she thought no one was looking. The way her voice cracked when a neighbor calmly contradicted her. The way her confidence seemed to depend entirely on the arrival of the patrol cars she was so certain would validate her actions. My wife had seen this before in suspects who talked themselves into corners, mistaking volume for strength. When the first distant siren became audible, the HOA woman froze mid-sentence. Her head snapped toward the sound, and a smile spread across her face, quick and triumphant. She clasped her hands together briefly, as if restraining herself for clapping. The crowd fell quieter, anticipation rippling outward. This was the moment everyone had been waiting for, whether they admitted it or not. As the patrol vehicles came into view, dust rising behind them, the HOA woman squared her shoulders and positioned herself front and center. She rehearsed her opening lines under her breath, lips moving silently. She didn't look at my wife anymore. In her mind, a confrontation was already over. What she didn't realize was that escalation doesn't always favor the loudest voice. Sometimes it favors the most prepared. Sometimes it favors the person who understands the system better than anyone else involved. And sometimes escalation simply reveals the truth that was always there, waiting patiently beneath the noise. As the vehicle slowed and pulled to a stop near the gate, the officers stepped out and surveyed the scene with professional caution. They took in the crowd, the phones, the signage, and finally the two women standing near the fence line. The HOA woman surged forward, launching into her story before anyone could ask a question, her words tumbling over one another in her eagerness to control the narrative. My wife stayed where she was. She knew that this phase of the confrontation was no longer about argument or explanation. It was about process, about observation, about letting the facts surface in their own time. The escalation the HOA woman had demanded had arrived, but not in the way she expected, and as the officers began to ask their first questions, it became clear to anyone paying attention that the balance of power was already shifting, quietly but decisively, in broad daylight. The patrol vehicles rolled to a stop in a slow, deliberate line, tires crunching over gravel as dust lifted and drifted across the road. The flashing lights reflected off windshields, fence wire, and the metal gate, casting brief pulses of red and blue across the gathered faces. Conversations died down almost instantly. Even the people still recording lowered their voices, instinctively aware that this was the moment everything would be decided. Authority had arrived, and with it consequences. Two officers stepped out first, hands resting casually near their belts, their posture alert but controlled. They scanned the scene the way seasoned law enforcement always does, taking in details before engaging. The crowd, the phones, the signage on the gate, the tension that hung in the air like static. A third officer exited the second vehicle and joined them, nodding once as they exchanged quick, silent assessments. None of them rushed. Rushing meant reacting, and reacting meant giving up control. The HOA woman wasted no time. She marched forward with purpose, heels striking the ground sharply, her voice already raised before she reached them. She launched into her explanation without waiting to be asked, speaking quickly and loudly, layering accusation upon accusation. She pointed back toward the gate, then at my wife, then at the surrounding land as if ownership itself were something she could gesture into existence. She claimed obstruction. She claimed defiance. She claimed authority. Her words tumbled over one another, urgency fueled by the belief that the officers were there to validate her. One of the officers raised a hand gently but firmly. "Ma'am," he said, his tone calm and practiced, "we'll get to everything. Let's slow this down." That interruption visibly irritated her. She was not used to being paused. Still, she took a breath and continued, lowering her voice, just enough to sound reasonable while keeping its sharp edge intact. She emphasized that she represented the HOA. She stressed that residents had complained. She repeated the word rules several times, each repetition carrying the same unspoken assumption that rules, once spoken aloud, became law. The officers listened without interrupting, their expressions neutral. When she finished, one of them asked a simple question. "Is this your property?" The HOA woman hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. "Well, it's community access," she said finally, sidestepping the question. "The HOA?" The officer nodded once, then turned his attention toward my wife. "And you?" he asked. My wife met his gaze calmly. She identified herself by name, stated that the land was private property, and explained that the access road had been legally closed years prior. She spoke evenly, without embellishment, and referenced posted signage and county documentation. There was no defensiveness in her voice, no attempt to dominate the conversation. She spoke as someone who expected to be verified. As she finished, one of the officers looked again at the gate, at the signs bolted into the wood, at the clearly marked boundary indicators. He exchanged a brief glance with his partner. It was the kind of look that carried an entire conversation without words. The HOA woman noticed. She interjected immediately, insisting that signs could be put up by anyone and that HOA rules superseded local misunderstandings. Her frustration was creeping back into her tone, impatience bubbling just beneath the surface. She leaned in slightly as if proximity alone could tilt the outcome in her favor. That was when the officer asked for identification. The HOA woman produced hers quickly, holding it out with a confident flourish. When it was my wife's turn, she reached into her pocket slowly and deliberately. There was no drama in the movement, no announcement, no attempt to draw attention. She simply removed her badge and identification and handed them over. The effect was immediate. The officer's posture changed the moment he saw it. His eyes flicked from the badge to my wife's face and back again. His partner noticed too, straightening subtly. The third officer, who had been observing quietly from a few steps back, moved closer, curiosity sharpening into recognition. There was a pause, not an awkward one, but a heavy one. The kind that settles when the truth arrives uninvited. The officer handed the badge back with visible respect, addressing my wife by her title without being prompted. Radios went quiet. The dynamic shifted so abruptly that even the crowd seemed to feel it. Phones steadied. Whispers stopped. The HOA woman stared, confusion spreading across her face as she sensed something had gone terribly wrong with her expectations. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice suddenly thinner. The officer didn't answer her right away. Instead, he asked my wife a few clarifying questions about the road closure, the prior agreements, and the safety concerns that led to the gate being installed. My wife answered each one clearly and concisely, referencing dates, agencies, and procedures. These were not the vague responses of someone scrambling for justification. These were the precise answers of someone who had lived the process from start to finish. The officers nodded along, air understanding deepening with each sentence. The HOA woman tried to interrupt again, but this time she was stopped more firmly. "Ma'am," the officer said, turning toward her, "we'll need you to wait." The words landed hard. She stepped back reluctantly, her earlier confidence unraveling. The reality she had refused to consider was now unavoidable. The officers were no longer treating this as a simple complaint from a community representative. They were treating it as a potential trespassing dispute on private land, with one party possessing significant legal authority and documented evidence. One of the officers requested to see the county paperwork. My wife retrieved the folder from her truck and handed it over. Pages were flipped, names were checked, boundaries were confirmed. Each document reinforced the same conclusion. The road was private, the closure was lawful. The HOA had no jurisdiction here. As this unfolded, the HOA woman's body language changed dramatically. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest, her jaw clenched. She shifted her weight from foot to foot, glancing occasionally at the crowd as if searching for support that was no longer there. The audience she had relied on for validation now watched in silence, the narrative she had built collapsing piece by piece. Finally, the officer turned fully toward her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but professional, "this is private property. You've been informed of that multiple times. At this point, your refusal to leave constitutes trespassing." Her eyes widened. "That's ridiculous," she protested. "I called you. I'm the one who—" "Calling us doesn't grant authority," the officer replied calmly. "And it doesn't override property law." The words hit harder than any raised voice could have. She opened her mouth to argue again, but the officer continued, explaining clearly and methodically what would happen. On next. She could leave voluntarily or she could face citation. The choice was hers. There was no anger in his tone, no satisfaction, just certainty. For the first time since she arrived, the HOA woman was silent. She looked at my wife, then at the officers, then back at the gate she had demanded be opened. The realization settled slowly, visibly. She had escalated a situation she did not understand. She had assumed power where she had none, and now, in front of witnesses and cameras, she was being confronted with the consequences of that assumption. As she was escorted back toward her vehicle, murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some people lowered their phones, the climax already captured. Others exchanged glances that carried equal parts relief and disbelief. The scene that had begun as a loud assertion of authority had ended in quiet correction. My wife remained by the gate, composed and steady. She hadn't raised her voice. She hadn't threatened. She hadn't revealed her position until the process required it. She had simply stood her ground and allowed the system to do what it was designed to do. Watching her in that moment, it was clear that the real power in the situation had never been about who shouted the loudest or claimed the most rules. It had been about knowing where authority truly begins and ends. And the HOA woman had just learned that lesson the hard way. Once the HOA woman was no longer dominating the conversation, the truth had room to breathe. The officers didn't rush the next steps. They moved with the careful, procedural patience that comes from knowing every action might be scrutinized later. One of them stepped slightly away from the group to radio in details, while another remained near the gate, reviewing the paperwork page by page. Each flipped sheet sounded louder than it should have in the sudden quiet, a steady rhythm underscoring how methodical the process really was. The HOA woman hovered near her vehicle, arms wrapped tightly around herself, her earlier certainty now replaced with restless agitation. She muttered under her breath, occasionally shaking her head as if denial alone could rewrite what was unfolding. A few times she tried to reinsert herself into the discussion, stepping forward with half-formed objections, but each attempt was gently and firmly shut down. The officers had shifted their focus, and she was no longer the center of it. The lead officer confirmed the property boundaries using the county maps, cross-checking them against the visible survey markers embedded in the ground. He asked clarifying questions about the history of the easement, the incidents that led to its closure, and the emergency access protocol. My wife answered calmly, never embellishing, never editorializing. Dates, departments, outcomes, fact after fact, each one reinforcing the same conclusion. There was no gray area left to exploit. As the reality settled in, the officer turned back toward the HOA woman. "Ma'am," he said, "you were informed this was private property before we arrived. Multiple witnesses confirmed that. You were asked to leave and refused." She immediately protested, insisting she had been confused, that she believed she had authority, that the rules were unclear. Her voice wavered between defensiveness and indignation, searching for a version of events that might still place her in the right. But confusion does not negate responsibility, and belief does not replace law. The officer explained this plainly, without condescension, laying out the difference between HOA governance and county jurisdiction in terms so simple, they were impossible to misunderstand. The citation was written slowly, deliberately. Each word was explained as it was recorded: trespassing, refusal to comply, disorderly conduct warnings noted but not charged. The officer made it clear that the decision not to escalate further was based on her eventual compliance and the absence of physical interference. It was a mercy she did not acknowledge. Instead, she fixated on the perceived injustice of the moment, shaking her head as if the world had betrayed her. When the citation was handed to her, she stared at it for several seconds before taking it. Her hands trembled slightly. This was not the outcome she had envisioned when she made that call. She had expected validation, applause, perhaps even an apology. What she received instead was a documented reminder that authority has limits, and crossing them carries consequences. The neighbors watched quietly. Some nodded to themselves, satisfaction mingling with relief. Others looked uncomfortable, realizing how easily they too could have believed the wrong narrative if they hadn't known the history. A few approached my wife afterward, thanking her softly for handling the situation with restraint. She accepted their words with polite nods, never seeking praise. To her, this wasn't a victory, it was resolution. Before leaving, one of the officers addressed the small crowd, clarifying the property boundaries and reminding everyone that HOA authority ended where private land began. He encouraged anyone with questions to attend county meetings or review public records rather than relying on assumption or rumor. It was a brief statement, but an important one. Misinformation thrives in silence, and today, silence had been broken. The HOA woman drove away without another word, tires kicking up dust as she turned back toward the development. She did not look back. She did not apologize. She did not wave. The gate remained closed behind her, unchanged, unmoved, exactly as it had been before she arrived. In the days that followed, the truth continued to surface. Videos circulated online showing the confrontation from multiple angles. Comments poured in, many from people who had experienced similar overreach in their own communities. The HOA board issued a carefully worded notice reminding residents of jurisdictional boundaries and advising representatives to coordinate with legal counsel before engaging in disputes involving non-HOA property. It wasn't an apology, but it was an admission. The woman herself stopped attending HOA meetings shortly after. Whether from embarrassment or resentment, no one could say. What mattered was that the ranch was left alone. The road stayed closed. The rules that mattered remained enforced. For my wife, the incident faded quickly into the background of a career built on far more serious challenges. But for the community, it became a quiet turning point. People talked more openly about boundaries, about authority, about the difference between enforcing rules and abusing them. The spectacle had ended, but the lesson lingered. The truth had come out not through shouting or force, but through patience, documentation, and the simple act of letting the right process unfold. And once it did, there was no arguing with it. The ranch was quiet again once the dust settled, the kind of quiet that feels earned rather than accidental. The gate stood exactly where it always had, its metal frame warm from the sun, its lock untouched since the confrontation ended. Cattle moved slowly across the far pasture, unaware of the drama that had unfolded only hours earlier. Life resumed not because anything had changed, but because what mattered had been upheld. Boundaries were still boundaries. Law was still law. That evening, as the light softened and the sky shifted into deeper shades of orange and blue, my wife walked the fence line like she always did. It wasn't a patrol or a show of ownership. It was routine, grounding, a reminder of why we had chosen this life in the first place. The land didn't care about titles, rules, or egos. It responded only to consistency and respect. In that way, it wasn't so different from the law itself. Word traveled quickly through the community. By the next morning, nearly everyone had heard some version of the story. Some accounts were exaggerated, others were simplified. But the core truth remained intact. An HOA representative had overstepped. Private property had been challenged. The challenge had failed. People discussed it in driveways, at mailboxes, and online. For many, it was the first time they had seriously considered where HOA authority actually ended. For others, it confirmed suspicions they had long held but never seen proven so clearly. The HOA board's response was cautious and calculated. A notice was sent out reminding residents that the association's jurisdiction did not extend beyond its mapped boundaries. The language was neutral, almost clinical, but the message was unmistakable. Representatives were advised to avoid direct confrontations and to consult legal counsel when disputes involved non-HOA land. It was an attempt to restore credibility without admitting fault. No names were mentioned, no apologies offered. Still, the shift in tone spoke volumes. The woman at the center of it all became noticeably absent. She didn't show up at the next HOA meeting. She didn't attend community events. Her social media, once filled with posts about enforcement and compliance, went quiet. Some people speculated that she was embarrassed. Others believed she was angry. The truth was likely a mix of both. When someone builds their identity around authority, having that authority publicly dismantled leaves very little to stand on. My wife never spoke about her afterward unless asked. When neighbors brought it up, she redirected the conversation toward the larger issue: boundaries, process, the importance of knowing the difference between personal belief and legal reality. She didn't relish the outcome. She didn't frame it as a win. To her, it was simply what happens when the system works as intended. No more, no less. What stayed with me was how many people admitted, quietly and almost sheepishly, that they would have assumed the HOA woman was right if they hadn't seen the documents themselves. That realization was unsettling. It revealed how easily confidence and repetition can be mistaken for truth, how quickly people defer to perceived authority without questioning its source. The incident became a lesson not just about HOAs, but about vigilance. Over the following weeks, fewer cars slowed near the gate. Fewer people tested the boundary. The ranch was no longer seen as an inconvenience to be challenged, but as a fact to be respected. That shift didn't come from fear of enforcement. It came from clarity. Once the truth was visible, denial lost its power. For my wife, the experience reinforced something she had known throughout her career. Authority without accountability is fragile. Real authority doesn't announce itself. It doesn't posture. It waits, confident that it can withstand scrutiny. The HOA woman had relied on volume and assumption. My wife had relied on patience and proof. Only one of those approaches survives daylight. One evening, as we sat on the porch watching the horizon darken, she finally reflected on it aloud. "People think being in charge means telling others what to do," she said. "It doesn't. It means knowing when you can act, when you can't, and accepting both." That was the lesson the HOA woman never learned, and the one the community witnessed firsthand. The story didn't end with applause or public shaming. It ended quietly, the way most real lessons do, with a gate still closed, with land still protected, with a reminder that rules only matter when they're real, and authority only matters when it's earned. In the end, nothing extraordinary happened. The law was followed, the truth was acknowledged, and life went on. Sometimes that's what winning actually looks like.